In this class, we look at the halachic debate over freeing hostages as it unfolded in Israel during the 1970s. After the September 1970 triple hijacking, several poskim weighed in on whether it was permitted to meet the terrorist demands. The discussion resurfaced after the Yom Kippur War a few years later, and then again in the wake of the famous Entebbe raid. There's an auction house that is known by the name of Winners. And in June of 2018, they put up for sale a letter that has the signature of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And this letter is dated Ches Elul Tovshin Lamed. This is September of 1970. And the letter is addressed to Rosh Mimshalas Yisrael, the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, in Yerushalayim. What does this letter say? Asifa dechufa shel Agudas Harabanim. There was an emergency meeting by Agudas Harabanim, the Association of Rabbis in America, and Dana b'chovid roish, and we dealt with the very serious problem about alamatzev hamasukon, the dangerous situation of shvuyei hacherev, of the war captives, hanimsoim b'Yarden, who are currently in Jordan. Val koishi ha'achra. We also discussed the difficult decision shel Medinas Yisrael b'nidain, about the state of Israel in this regard. This is the opening sentence of this letter from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He's the Nasi of Agudas Harabanim, and he's writing to Golda Meir, September 1970. What is this issue? What are they talking about? On the 6th of September, it was a Sunday, the Hebrew date was Hey Elul Tovshin Lamed in 1970. There were multiple hijackings that occurred by Palestinian terrorists, and ultimately 3 airplanes were diverted and taken to a desert area in northern Jordan, and they were held there for quite a while. At a certain point, many of the passengers were set free, but a number were kept. Some 50 or so were kept. The vast majority of them Jewish. The objective of this terrorism was to free terrorists who were mostly in Israeli jails, but as well some of whom were in European jails. So that means there's going to be demands made of the Israeli government as well as of some European governments. And what we're learning from this letter, and I'm going to have to assume that it's an authentic letter and that Winners is a reliable auction house and that they vetted this and that they know that this is an authentic letter, that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is telling us that Agudas Harabanim had an emergency meeting about this matter, and now they're going to tell Mrs. Golda Meir their opinion. We feel it's appropriate to tell us what our opinion is. Al pi din, the halacha is yesh la'atzalas nefashos din kedima. To save the lives of the Jews who are held hostage, this takes precedence to any other factor. And therefore, if there is no other choice, al medinas Yisrael lemale drishas hamachablim, the state of Israel must meet the demands of the terrorists, kedei lahatzil nashes hashvuyim, in order to save the lives of the captives. Signed, Harav Moshe Feinstein, the Nasi Agudas Harabanim, the president of the Agudas Harabanim. In this letter, there's no svaris, there's no maramekoimis, there's no arguments. All we have is the statement that Moshe Feinstein is saying that Atzalas Nefashos takes precedence to anything else, and so therefore, if it's a question of saving the lives of these Jews, basically we must give in to the terror. Now, by definition, if we ask Moshe Feinstein, what about the fact that you're not allowed to overpay to get captives back? The Isser that we've been talking about in the previous classes, so he would tell you that in one way or another, that poses no obstacle in this case, but he doesn't explain why. So maybe it would be, for example, we saw the svara that if it's pikuach nefesh, then the Isser doesn't apply. So maybe Rav Moshe supported that. I don't know. We don't know exactly what he would say, but one thing is clear. Assuming the authenticity of this letter, Rav Moshe Feinstein did not believe that it was halachically inappropriate. To the contrary, he believed it was halachically appropriate to meet the demands of the terrorists. Okay, now I want to share with you something interesting. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was the Nasi of Agudas HaRabbanim, but the Yoshev Rosh of Agudas HaRabbanim was Rabbi Simcha Elberg. And we have Yumanim where people write what was going on in 770. And one of the people, for example, is Rabbi Meir Harlig. And he writes, what time the Rebbe came to 770, what time the Rebbe went home, did the Rebbe come out to Mincha, etc., all these details. When it comes to Ches Elul, which is the same day that this letter was written, Rabbi Meir Harlig in his Yuman tells us that Rabbi Simcha Elberg, who was the Yoshev Rosh of Agudas HaRabbanim, had an afternoon Yechidus with the Rebbe. Okay, so I don't know. I don't think maybe I'm going out on a little bit of a limb over here, but I think that maybe there's a connection. If Agudas HaRabbanim put out a statement on Ches Elul, and Rabbi Simcha Elberg had a meeting with the Rebbe on that same day, maybe there's a connection there. Now, does it mean that the Rebbe agrees with what it says in this letter? I am not saying that. All I'm saying is that the possibility that the meeting that Rabbi Simcha Elberg had with the Rebbe on Ches Elul Tavshin Lamed may have been about this issue. Okay, now let's continue. We're going to get a little more details about this case, and another person stating their opinion we're going to get from a rabbinic journal. Today in today's shir, we're going to turn to a lot of rabbinic journals that were coming out during the 1970s. So this journal is called Hamor, and it's the issue that came out in Elul Tavshin Lamed, and the writer of this piece is Mem Abramson. And he writes as follows. B'chodesh hazeh, in this month, we had the act of terror where 56 Jews were removed from these airplanes. Most of them are Jews from America and Israel. And then he tells us a very important detail that I didn't share as of yet. Among these 56 Jews who are held captive, one of them is a great Rosh Yeshiva, Rab Harav Agoin Rab Yitzchak Hutner Shlita, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Reb Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn. He and his family are among the captives. And the terrorists are demanding 600 freed prisoners from Eretz Yisrael and from other European countries. Says Mem Abramson, Kvar hispateach shakla v'tarya ben aloim denkan. So the Lumdim, the Rabbanim now in Brooklyn, in New York, are talking about this sugya. In other words, should we give in or not? Ukafi anishman, rumor has it that Agoin Rav Moshe Feinstein Shlita Hizir, he has said, Shabedinas Yisrael mechuyaves lasis yoyser ma shebicholta. Israel has to do more than it's willing to do. La'asalas nefashos. So here we have another voice telling us that he has information that Rav Moshe Feinstein told the state of Israel that they must give in to the terrorists. Miu. And however, Echad min HaRabbanim, one of the rabbis, he doesn't say who, Shmi Adaitoi made his opinion known, She'asr la l'sholtainis medinas Yisrael l'shachar afilu terrorist Echad. Israel's not allowed to give up even one guy, one of the rabbis said. He doesn't tell us which rabbi. Why? Ki yesh lachosh, we need to be afraid, sheyushluchu shuv lara Yehudim Rachman al-Islam. We need to be afraid, obviously. You're going to let out a terrorist, what's he going to do? He's going to, God forbid, Rachman al-Islam. He may harm other Jews. And so therefore, we shouldn't give in at all. Now, this Mem Abramson needs to take a stand. On the one hand, Rav Moshe Feinstein said something. On the other hand, there's a Rav Echad, a nameless rabbi. So he's going to tell you what his opinion is. Daitel shal Rav Zeh, this rabbi who forbids the exchange, Misames l'daitei shal asar hachutz hareformi Ibn. That is consistent with Israel's foreign minister. His name was Abba Ibn, and he calls him the reformer. In other words, I don't like Abba Ibn, and I don't like Abba Ibn's opinion, and therefore I'm happy to link this rabbi who I disagree with, I'm happy to link him with Abba Ibn. Why Abba Ibn? Abba Ibn on September 16th. So this was 10 days into this crisis. The Israeli government, by the way, was not forthcoming in terms of what its position is. Very vague, at least publicly. There were no public statements of what's going to do, what's not going to do. They definitely didn't come and say that they're open to making a deal. And there was a lot of ambiguity during these earlier days. Finally, 10 days in, on September 16th, Abba Ibn gave a speech in front of the Knesset, and he basically said Israel's not going to be giving in anything, and the European countries that are calling on us to make concessions because they had an interest, because they wanted to get their citizens out, They said Israel made a big enough concession already. Why? Because Switzerland and England agreed to let out 1 or 2 people. Who are those people going to hurt? They're going to hurt Israelis. So we already made the concession by the fact that you guys agreed in principle to let those people out. That's enough of a concession. We're not letting anyone out of our prisons. This is what he said. And so Mem Abramson is taking this nameless rabbi, linking him together with Abba Ibn, and saying, I don't like their position. In fact, he goes on to say, why don't these 2 people go to Jordan, turn themselves in, and say, we'll take the place of Rabbi Hutner and 1 of the other people if they're so serious about their words. A very polemical type of journalistic piece here. But now, halachically, he turns to the rabbi and says, Tema Rabba la Ravahu, I have a great question on this rabbi. Where did he find in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch that we have an obligation, which Lo Ysamar Adam Reyecha means that we need to intervene to save someone's life? Where did he find that this is Noyeg Rak Shebavada Yenshuch Shash Takol Lamishu? Where do you see that Lo Ysamar Adam Reyecha is only if there's no risk to anyone? When you have someone, a victim, who is currently in danger, and he's yelling, Ana Atziluna, please save me. So you can say, Lo Ysamar Adam Reyecha doesn't apply over here because I'm worried about some future lies. Where does he get that from? Or in other words, to phrase it differently, Mem Abramson is telling us that in his opinion, we are obligated to assume risk. When there's a current danger before us, then we need to kind of just deal with that, save the person who's currently at risk, and worry about the potential risk at some later date. He continues and concludes his article saying, Tikvaseinu Aza, our strength, we hope very strong. Even before this Hamor of Elul Tafshan Lamed comes out, that they will be rescued, and they will go free. In other words, when he wrote this in Elul Tafshan Lamed, they still were in captivity. So obviously I was very curious to figure out who this Mem Abramson is. So I started Googling different rabbis, last name Abramson in New York. There's a few false leads, but then I realized that the answer was right under my nose. The Oirich, the editor of Hamor, his name was Meir Amsel, and his father's name was Avram. So the second I figured out that Meir Amsel's father was Avram, it became abundantly clear that Mem Abramson is Meir ben Avram. In other words, this is Rabbi Meir Amsel. He was a very well-known figure. He was the editor of Hamor, and he's the one who's telling us his opinion over here. So if we're keeping score as of now, what do we have? We have Rav Moshe Feinstein is pro the exchange. Rabbi Meir Amsel is pro the exchange. However, we have one nameless rabbi who is against the exchange. Now, before I conclude and wrap up this particular part of the story, I want to tell you something that the Rebbe said. The Rebbe did not make any public statements in this decade, meaning I shouldn't say this decade, because we'll come to 1979 in the next class. But in this period of time, in 1970, the Rebbe didn't make any pronouncements, as far as I know, about these hostage exchanges. But the Rebbe did speak about this issue and the problem during this crisis. This was Shabbos Parsha Savai. It was Chai Elul. This is September 19th. And these 50 or so Jews were still in captivity in Jordan. And the Rebbe said as follows toward the end of the Fabrengen. The Rebbe said, Chai Elul is a yard side of the Maharal of Prague. And therefore, it's Chusay Gadol of Araisu helfen Adi Alav Kochen sich im Maharal. Any Jew who's very involved with the Maharal is going to be able to protect him. Who is this? Rabbi Kleitman remembers this Sikha. Who is this? This is Rabbi Hutner. Rabbi Hutner was very into the Maharal's Torah. And the Rebbe says that we should have chazak v'yamitz libecha v'kaveh el Hashem, which is pasuk in Tehillim, that we should strengthen our trust in Hashem. And the Rebbe points out that das is ha'im shetzarich chizuk. In other words, trust is something that you need to work on. You need to work on strengthening it. That's the diuk in the pasuk. Chazak v'yamitz libecha v'kaveh el Hashem. You need to have courage. You need to build that type of trust. And here the Rebbe says a very interesting line. Even though the trust, the trach gut, hasn't worked yet, because it's some, 20 days, and they're in captivity, still we have to insist on trust. And Demol, the Eibusher is going to make Nisim Gluyim. Okay, so this was September 19th. Already a few days before, King Hussein of Jordan began a war, essentially, against the Palestinian terrorists. And during the whole mess of war, at a certain point, the terrorists decided, you know what, forget it, and they handed over the captives to whoever they were handed over to, and they were flown out of Jordan on September 27th, and Rabbi Hutner came back to New York a day or two before Rosh Hashanah, and that was the conclusion of that story. A very miraculous ending in terms of the way all of these captives were eventually released. But in terms of our main objective for today, in terms of understanding how the issue of Pidyon Shvuyim and the question of overpaying plays out in Eretz Yisrael, we already see that there's a little bit of a debate. On the one hand, we see where Moshe Feinstein said, and what? Rabbi Meir Amsel is saying, but then at the same time, we see another voice, and as we continue talking, that other voice is going to be amplified, even as Ramoshe's voice is also going to be amplified, and that we're going to continue seeing through the end of today's shir. In the aftermath of this event in 1970, there was an article written by Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni. He wrote this in an American journal called Hadoraim, Nisan Tov Lamed Aleph. So it's a year later. Almost 6 months later. And Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, if you heard the name Rabbi Eliezer Silver, was a famous American rabbi, it's his son-in-law. Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, during these years, lived in Brooklyn. Before that and after that, he lived in Eretz Yisrael. So he deals with the question, what should we do when we have terrorists? And they say, well, this is the famous question, what should we do? So the first thing he does is he goes back to some of the sources we looked in the previous classes, and he pulls out the Pikuach Nefesh Heter. He says, you're not allowed to overpay, but if it's Pikuach Nefesh, then it's mutter. One of the poskim who said this was the Marshal, the Yam Shel Shloimeh, he brings him. The Yam Shel Shloimeh said that if it's Sakonis Nefashis, Paidin es Hashu, and Yoser Mikmei Demand, you're allowed to overpay. So you're allowed to overpay. That probably means you're allowed to give in to their demands and give them whatever they want back. And so that would be room for a heter. However, Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni then says something very, very important. And this is the realization that 1970 in Israel is very different than the 1560s in Lublin or anywhere else in the world. All the cases that we saw over the last 2 weeks fit into one box, Rabbi Gershuni is going to say, and the situation in Israel fits in a very different box. Why? Look what he says. The situation in Israel today is completely different. Because the machablim ha'aravim, is you're going to give them freedom. They're going to reorganize to kill Jews and to engage in acts of terror. So in other words, what he's saying over here is, let's talk about the worst case scenarios. Let's go back to the ancient concept. So if you overpaid, what were we afraid of? Well, we were afraid of, besides for the current financial crisis, we were afraid of that maybe it's going to incentivize more kidnapping. So what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is we overpaid. And now there's a guy who's going to say, let me start targeting Jews because it's going to be good for business. So he's going to attack and target Jews. And so the worst case scenario is more captives. All right, so we'll get those captives out. Okay, and maybe even those more captives will also be in danger. Okay, but we'll get more money and we'll get them out. So that's one thing. But now we're dealing with, if we release terrorists, then what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is extreme bloodshed. So it's just a very, very different situation. Or in other words, what he's going to say here essentially is, even if you dealt with the sugya in Gittin, the sugya in Gittin is the one that says, Ein poidin yoser mechmei demand. And even if you put that to rest, because you say, oh, well, it's not an issue because of pikuach nefesh or whatever, you still have a different issue in Israel. And that's the issue of doing acts now that are essentially endangering people in the future. And that's what he says right here. Hare, yes, sakanas nefashis neged sakanas nefashis. There's a sakanas nefashis of the hostages now against the sakanas nefashis of the future people. Sakanas nefashis shel hashvuyim neged sakanas nefashis shel anshe hayishuv, of the regular citizens. Sha'idei shichra machablim yisrabu ma'aser etzicha yishuvim imim. There's going to be more terror on Jewish settlements. V'chidoichin nefesh mipnei nefesh. Do we kill one to save another, or do we allow one to die to save another? Then he goes on to say, one second, maybe you can make the following argument. You could say, the hostages right now, they're in a vadai sakana. If we don't do anything, they're for sure going to die. They're for sure going to be killed. The future, lav dafka, it's not 100% that people are going to die. Why? Because maybe Israel will be successful after they release these terrorists. Maybe some of them won't go back to terror. Maybe those who do, maybe they'll be caught. Maybe they will not be successful because something will go awry in their planning. And so there's a few elements of doubt. And so maybe it's we have a vadai sakana people here, and maybe we should say we should prefer the vadai sakana and save the vadai sakana and put aside the suffix sakana and what's going to happen in the future. Says he, doesn't work that way. Why? Look at the final two lines of his quote. Because the majority of achroinim hold that we should not enter a dangerous situation, even if it's only 50-50. 50-50 is going to be dangerous for me. Don't enter that dangerous situation, even if the other person is like vadai sakana. So in other words, let's take a classic case. Let's say someone, chas v'shalom, is drowning at sea. So if I don't do anything, that person is vadai sakana, for sure dying. However, the weather is terrible. I'm a terrible swimmer. There's a hurricane coming. I don't know, make a whole bunch of factors. So it's very dangerous for me to do this. But whatever, it's a 50-50. Says he that the din is, don't. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to do it, even though that guy is vadai sakana and you're suffix sakana. Now the emes is like this. There's three shittas when it comes to this issue. There's three shittas for the case I just gave you. Suffix sakana versus vadai sakana, what do you do? One shitta says it's a chiyuv to intervene. One shitta says there's a rishus to intervene, but it's not a chiyuv. And another shitta says that it's asr to intervene. He's going with the third shitta that it's asr to intervene. If you look at the Entebbe, in Siman Shin Chav Tes, in Hilchos Shabbos, the Entebbe brings this. Entebbe says asr. It's asr. Why? Because we have a chayban. We have a mandate in the Torah of a chayban. The chayban includes that a mitzvah shouldn't lead to death, and that includes even suffix. The mitzvah that I'm doing shouldn't lead the rescuer to the rescuer's death. And so therefore, and even if it's a suffix, this is the case. So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, I don't see how this is going to be permitted. You could invoke the Yam Shel Shloimeh, you could invoke the Heter Pikuach Nefesh. All that does is it puts to rest the issue of Gittin. But here we have a different issue. You're not allowed to enter a dangerous thing, and by extension, you're not allowed to cause a dangerous scenario for other people in order to save people in a vadai sakana. And so therefore, for this reason, he says, we're in a very different reality right now, and so I don't think this is mutter, Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni says. Then he goes further, and it brings another point. His other point is, again, go back to the ancient concept. There, what are you giving them? You're giving money. Here, you're taking people with blood on their hands who are in prison because they did a terrible crime. Crime needs to be punished. And by you releasing them, you're essentially undermining the concept of a justice system. That's not okay, he says. And he brings an interesting tshuva to demonstrate this case. This tshuva is the Tzemach Tzedek. However, this is not the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. This is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmal. And he named his sefer, Shalos Tshuva Tzemach Tzedek. He lived in the 1600s in Moravia. Today it's the area of Czechoslovakia. And basically, the shaila that comes his way is as follows. There's a person who's killed, a Jew who's killed. We know the murderer, we know the non-Jewish murderer. And we could actually exact retribution. In other words, we could sue him in court. Okay, the way it works today, when there's a murder, it's not a private suit. It's not like the family sues. That's a civil case. Criminal case, the state does it. But in Moravia in the 1600s, it didn't work that way. If, God forbid, there was a murder, the obligation was on the family to file a claim. So we could do that. We could file a claim. But we need one of the relatives to do it. So the problem is that the relatives say, I'm not so interested. Oh, I'm not filing the claim. No filing the claim, no justice. So the community member, the leaders wanted to know, can they force the family member to file the claim? Question number one. Question number two, and what if he says, well, the issue is money? Can we say, too bad, you need to pay for it. This is something you need to pay for. In other words, when you file the claim, you also need to pay the basic fees. So the Tzemach Tzedek answered, yes. Yes, you could force, the community could force the relatives that they have to pursue this guy. And he goes into a whole long arichis of where we see in Shas that there's such a thing, that the relatives have to file the suit. Okay, but that doesn't concern us today. But then he goes, it appears to me, he shouldn't be obligated to pay more than the normal fees. What are the normal fees? The normal fees that you give the judges and the police officers and the saradioid, whatever, there's normal fees that you need to do. However, if you need money for militzos and sheichadim, So in other words, melitzis is like letters of recommendation. Essentially, in order, the prosecutor says, sorry, you need to get a letter from someone else. You basically need to bribe him or whatever it is. It's a corrupt justice system. Says that you can't force the guy to pay. Why? We're afraid if you're going to do that, what are the family members, God forbid, if a murder happens, they're going to say, this is going to turn into a huge financial burden for us. Let's skip town. Let's just get out of here. And then you're not even going to be able to sue them. You remember, you need the family to sue. So therefore, the smarter thing is to say the family needs to sue. They need to pay the basic fees. If it's excessive, then the community will pick up the tab. Now, the question is, why should the community, why should the average Chaim Yankel have to pay? Why is this my issue? So he says it is everyone's issue. Why? Because kol oivrei derech besakana zuem. Any person who travels on the road, this gives you a little window into, we know this from other places. A lot of these, it was traveling on the road that was very dangerous. And this is where a lot of these incidents happen. Anyone who travels has a need for security. And he says, if we're not going to punish this guy, then the blood of Jews is going to be as hefker, it's ownerless. And so therefore, everyone needs to get involved because this is really everyone's protection. Then he goes on to say, this has happened in the past, that when the family wasn't able to do it, we would appoint people from the community and they would pursue murderers. And he goes on and says another thing. Sometimes we knew the evidence was flimsy and maybe there wasn't enough to actually get a conviction. But nonetheless, we sued in court anyway. Why? Because we're making a statement. This way everyone knows when a Jew is killed, someone's going to have to answer the question. And so even if we knew we're not going to get the guilty verdict, we're making a statement, and he ends off, says Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni. So what are we doing over here? We have people who kill Jews, and then we're letting them out of jail. What are you essentially telling the world? You're telling the world that Bnei Yisrael's blood is kehefker. And so therefore he says, even if that means allowing some people in captivity now to die, he says, the government's allowed to do that. The government is allowed to do that because this is takanas hatzibur, just like over there Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krachma insisted that there be implications and that there be punishment for someone who does murder, and therefore we're going to insist that something happens. So to here, there needs to be. And if that means some people in captivity now are going to die, so be it. We don't have a choice. This is a much more of a hard-line approach by Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni. I want to remind you that in Hamor, Rabbi Meir Amsel said that there was a rabbi who essentially said this argument. I'm not going to say that it's Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, but he does tell us over there. One of the rabbis said you're not allowed to do it because, and they're going to go and kill more Jews. So that's essentially the argument that we're seeing over here by Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni. He develops this at length in this essay that he wrote in Hadara. Now I want to share with you one other voice that also reached a similar conclusion, but with a different argument. And it was also during the story in Tafshan Lamed. This obviously happened before Rabbi Gershuni wrote his essay, but I wanted to put it over here as a second reason in terms of the idea of, one second, the situation right now is different. Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni did it in terms of, what is the worst case scenario? Worst case scenario there was more captives. Now worst case scenario is more death and Jewish blood. A statement about Jewish blood is very cheap. And now you're going to see another argument that was raised by someone else. Why the situation in Israel in 1970 is so different and therefore needs to be treated very different and lahachmir. So this comes from Rabbi Herschel Schechter. And in 1989 he wrote an essay in another journal, HaMizrach, and this is where he writes this information. I don't know how he has this information. Was he present at this meeting that he's going to tell us about, or he heard from someone else? I tried to get a hold of him to ask him, but I wasn't successful.
This is the late Rabbi Herschel.
This is the current Rabbi Herschel. Current, yeah. The current Rabbi Herschel Schechter of Yeshiva University. Yeah. Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Kalchana. Okay, so he says over there that during this crisis in 1970, one of the Rabbi Hutner had a balabas, a friend who was very wealthy, and said, let's go to the American government and tell the American government we're ready to give millions to get Rabbi Hutner out. And so the rabbi started talking about this. And they said, well, now you're mamish paying, and you're overpaying. So is that mutter? They said, yeah, one of the Hetairim was Talmud Chacham, and Rabbi Hutner is a huge Talmud Chacham, so therefore it should be mutter mitzad the overpaying. And at that moment, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, he said, no. He said, Ein hacheshbon hazeh, the Ein hacheshbon hazeh tzoydik b'chlal. No, this whole thing doesn't work out. Why? Because this whole thing of pidyon shvuyim, that you're allowed to overpay, not allowed to overpay, Talmud Chacham, that's only in times of peace. But in a time of war, you can't say that you stop fighting a war in order to free your captives with money. Because then you're helping your enemy fight against you. You're not allowed to help your enemy fight against you during a war. And he says, starting in 1948, there's been a war in Eretz Yisrael. And yes, there's been multiple ceasefires, but ultimately the war is still happening. Kala Mochammais, the Chala Price, all the acts of terror, and everything. It's all a continuation of that war. When you're in an act of war, you're not allowed to help your enemy. So finish, and I'll give them anything. This is another way of looking at this. Saying, one second, we're in a very, very different territory right now, and maybe all those haterim that we saw in the other situations, even putting aside the issue of future sakana and all that, would be a reason for Isser. And so what do you have here? Just in this story in 1970, you already see this recognition. We're two sides. The side that's permissive, the side that says, hold on, we're in new territory over here, and the permissions that we spoke about in prior centuries should no longer apply. That's scene one. Scene two takes us to the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, there was a ceasefire soon after the war started. That was, the war began Yom Kippur, so it was a few weeks after. There's already a ceasefire. But there was no agreement, what's called the disengagement of forces agreement, with Syria until the end of May. May 30th, 1974 is when Golda Meir presented to the Israeli Knesset the agreement on the disengagement of forces. Compare that to Egypt. Egypt signed such an agreement. It's not a peace agreement, but it's just an agreement that says the captives are going to go back, and we're going to bring the guns back, and that, because the ceasefire just means you stop shooting, but there's still other things that need to be taken care of. Egypt signed this type of agreement January 18th. So why didn't Syria sign for so long? Because Syria is being very obstinate, and they one of the things is they didn't even hand over a list of the names of the Israeli soldiers who were in Syrian captivity, and they didn't allow the Red Cross to access them, if that sounds familiar. And this was going on for many, many months. It was a big crisis in Israel. Because on the one hand, you want to have this agreement with Syria, disengagement of forces. On the other hand, they have our captives. What's going to happen? And so ultimately what happened is Israel made concessions. Israel made concessions. Number one, with Egypt, in their agreement, it said that Egypt is responsible to make sure no terror comes from its borders into Israel. And Egypt signed that. Syria, in their agreement, didn't say that. Number one. Number two, although there was some removal of weapons, there was a lot of heavy weapons that remained exactly in place, which was not what Israel wanted. And number three is Israel had to retreat from territory that it gained during the Yom Kippur War. Not all of the Golan, but some of the added territory that it gained during the Yom Kippur War, it conceded. And why? To get the captives back, to get the Israeli soldiers who were still held in captivity into May. So it was behemshech lazeh, during this period, or after this period, or around this time, that Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv, he was the editor of another journal called Tchumen. He passed away in 2018. So he wrote an article in Noyam, which is itself another journal. Tchumen and Noyam are similar. Anyway, he writes as follows. Most of the Rishonim and the poskim hold that the reason why we're not allowed to overpay is because we don't want to incentivize more kidnappings. Says he, Tam zeh ein kaim b'nidin shalom, that's inapplicable in our case. Why? Hashvuyim lo nishbu b'ofen yazum. The captives here, it wasn't like the Syrians came and said, oh, let's get captives. Right? It's not like pirates that are looking for captives or terrorists that are looking for captives. It was during a war, you have captives, so they weren't looking for it. There's no reason to assume that the Syrians are now going to start a policy of trying to get Israeli captives in a time of peace. Why would they do that? Or not peace, but not active hostilities. And moreover, if it's a time of war, then it's actually not a bad thing. You say to them as if it's in a time of war, if they see that you actually get good bang for your buck by having an Israeli soldier, so then in a time of war, instead of trying to kill, they'll actually take in captives. And so that's going to save soldiers in the future. So therefore he goes, if you follow the reason of incentivizing, I'm not concerned with the Syrians about the fact that we're making huge concessions toward them. What about the other reason of the Gemara? The other reason of the Gemara was the current financial problem. So although there isn't a financial issue here, but there are major concessions that are being made, whether land could also be considered money, for example. So he says, that also is something that needs to be taken into consideration. But let's remember, this whole thing, if it's pikuach nefesh, it pushes off this issue. And he says, everyone knows the Syrians are achzari, and therefore it's definitely the case that the Israeli captives that are being held by them are in a matzah pikuach nefesh, and so therefore it's okay to overpay to get them out. Then he says, I want to add two more details. And these two details are, number one, what about the morale? We have to always think about the morale of the Israeli soldiers. And if they know that we're going to do anything to get them back, they'll fight better. Okay, this is a morale argument. And then he says, it's a chilul Hashem if you have representatives of the Israeli people in captivity. Calls it a chilul Hashem, and that itself is a reason to overpay. And so therefore, when it comes to the question of the captives in Syria, he has no problem with the concessions that the Israeli government made in order to get the disengagement of forces. But then he goes on to say, but that's not going to be the same if it's a case of terror. Because it's a case of terror, or he says, if you're going to give up land that's next to populated cities. Because here, you're going to put people in danger. Whether you give out, if you release terrorists, you're putting people in danger. And so he says, then you come back to this issue of you're incentivizing terror, and we're not allowed to incentivize terror. You're basically incentivizing it, and therefore it's not going to be permitted because of the danger that this is going to cause. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv. He's added voice to the view that doesn't like the concept, although for the case in the Yom Kippur War, he was okay with it. Now, at the same time, around the same time, a little later that year, another rabbi, prominent in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, passed away in 1995. He gave an address in Eretz Yisrael at a kinos that was held on Zayin Elul Tafshan Lamed Daled, and he too dealt with both sides of the question. One, the Yom Kippur War, those captives, as well as captives of terror. Now, I need to tell you that by the time he was giving this speech, this was after another Maisa that happened in Israel, the Maisa of Ma'alot. This happened Chav Gimel Iyar, Tafshin Lamed Daled, where they held captive a whole bunch of kids in a school, and they also made demands. The Israeli government refused, tried to go in there, and it wasn't a very successful rescue effort. So this is very much both the Syrian issue as well as the terror issue is very much on people's minds in Eretz Yisrael at that time. Says Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, he begins with a very, very interesting chiddush, why he thinks it's okay for the Israeli government to essentially overpay to get its soldiers back. His argument is going to basically be that when the Israeli government takes soldiers to fight for them, it basically commits to them to get them back no matter what. Once it commits them to do that, so he says, again, I'm going to say his words because I can't say I fully understand what he's saying. Once the Israeli government commits to get the soldier back, so when the Israeli government is doing it, it's not redeeming the soldier, it's redeeming itself. Maybe if you want to use the word shluchah shaladam kamoisai, maybe that could help, right? So if there are shluchim, then we're us and right, so then we're one. So I'm not paying to get someone else out, I'm paying to get myself out. Now why does that matter? Because I didn't tell you all this time that there's a shitta from the Balei HaTosfos and it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that all the limitations are only on others. But the person himself, who's in captivity, if he wants to overpay, he could overpay. So Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli uses that logic to basically say, so therefore the Israeli government is allowed to overpay. That's the first thing that he says. But then he says, that only works for soldiers, but it doesn't work for cases of terror. Because cases of terror, they're usually taking regular citizens. It's interesting. It's like, it comes out from here, the Israeli government's responsibility to soldiers is greater than it is to the citizens. Remember, it represents citizens. Okay. So he says, here it's different. Number one, I don't have the argument of soldiers. And number two, here, if you're going to release hostages, right? With the Syrians, you're not releasing terrorists. But here, if you're going to be releasing terrorists, then we have the problem of exacerbating the problem of terror. So how are we going to deal with this problem? So then he says like this, you know what? This is what we're going to do. First, he brings the heter pikuach nefesh. Just pikuach nefesh, you're allowed to overpay. But then one second, there were people who objected to the heter pikuach nefesh. They said, what do you mean? The Gemara says every captive is in pikuach nefesh, and yet the Mishnah said you're not allowed to overpay to get captives. So this is Ramban's problem that we saw in a previous class, first class, on this subject. How could you say that if it's pikuach nefesh, you're allowed to overpay? Every captive is in a matzah pikuach nefesh. So he says, let's answer that question. The answer is, there's different levels of sakana. There's the standard level of sakana that a typical captive is in, but then there's the level of sakana that is where it's like, where mamish going to sit, where the terrorist is mamish coming to kill. So he says over here, in this case, where they're mamish going to kill, then we say, I'm going to prefer to save the person who's vaday sakana, and I'll take the risk of the suffix sakana, a similar argument that we saw before from one of the other rabbis, I don't remember right now. And so therefore he says that therefore in the case of taking hostages, when it's a sakana, he believes we should go with the side that says we can go ahead and do the deal. He then says, oh, but 1 second, what about the din that you're not allowed to go into sakana to save someone else? He says, no, it's not that you're not allowed to, it's just there's no chiyuv. Now I told you, in Achronim you have both views. He says there's no chiyuv. And so therefore, he says ultimately this is permitted, and he puts it in the hands of the Israeli government if they want to go ahead and they want to make this type of deal. This is the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. So in other words, for the Syrian problem, it seems like there was consensus on the issue that these concessions were okay, at least from the people who spoke publicly at the time. But here we saw, when it came to the issue of terror, the same thing repeating itself. Where on the one hand you saw one thing, that machlokes, the same machlokes we saw in Tav Shin Lamed Lamed Aleph, we see again here in Tav Shin Lamed Daled in 1974. And that brings us to the last scene from the 1970s that we're going to discuss today, and that is the story of Entebbe. This might have happened July 4th, 1976, where the Israeli government rescued the hostages in Entebbe in Africa. And Rabbi Ovadia Yosef gave a speech at the end of the year in Tav Shin Lamed Vav, Chav Gimel Av, Kinos L'Torah Shabal Peh, and he basically says at the speech as follows, and later he published it in multiple places. So he says, before the government chose to actually do the Entebbe raid, the families came to us and asked a halachic question. According to halacha, is it okay to free the 40 terrorists in Israeli prisons in order to save the 100 or so Jews who are trapped in Entebbe? What is his answer? He says, I'll tell you what my answer was. My answer was, pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh makes everything mutter. When it's a real sakana, we're not worried about the incentivizing, that we're worried they're going to come more. Sakana savash, we act right now. And then he adds another factor. He says, if you remember, Taisva said, another heter, one of the 9 hetadim was, in times of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, or during the time of war, I think we saw in Tunis or one of the other cities, where they take whoever they want, so you don't need to worry about overpaying, because you're not incentivizing and they need to do whatever they want. So he pulls out that argument here for terror in Israel, and he says, they're anyway doing whatever they want, they're anyway trying. You think they're going to try harder now? They're trying whatever they could to bother us. So you're not really going to change the bottom line if you give them more, if you return terrorists to them. And so therefore, he says he doesn't have a problem in terms of that. What about the fact that, again, you have another sugya the whole time? This always comes back. Even if you deal with the sugya in Gittin, you still have the other sugya. You don't go into a sakana to save someone else. So we already saw. One way out of that is to say what? Well, you're allowed to. It's mutter, it's not usher. That's one potential solution to that problem. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef gives another answer to that problem. I'm not allowed to put myself at risk in order to go and save someone else in a vaday sakana. Why? Because Torah tells me, chayacha koidmin. But what if there's a third party? What if there's a third party that needs to choose between someone who's currently in a vaday sakana and someone else who's a suffix sakana? So he says, in the case when it's a third party, so there's no chayacha koidmin. Torah, he's not in danger. The rescuer is not in danger. The rescuer is out of the danger. So what does Torah tell him? So he says, Torah tells that person, choose the vaday over the suffix. And so therefore, here he views the Israeli government deciders as outside the sakana. They're not in the sakana, which is an interesting statement, but that's what he says. They're outside the sakana. And so now, Torah doesn't tell them chayecha koidmin because they're not in danger at all. They now need to choose between the people in Entebbe right now, vaday sakana, and the future people, suffix sakana. You choose vaday over suffix. This is his way out of that particular problem. Now what he does is, he brings actually a number of interesting tshuva that we had a few months ago. We learned to bolster this particular claim. What's this tshuva? This tshuva comes from the 1500s from Rabbi Yosef ben Lev. Shalos tshuvis Maribal. He lived in Salonika. And he dealt with the case. We discussed this problem then. We said the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, what he would do is their government, they wanted to like mine for precious metals. But they didn't want to take the risk, because what if you don't find anything? So the solution was, you basically get a Jewish gvir, you force him to take the risk. If he finds gold, so then you split 50-50, whatever it is. The government made a lot of money and he's happy to. And if he doesn't find anything, then the whole loss is on him. This is what they were doing for a lot of different industries at the time. And they're essentially drafting Jews into this. So the shaila that was asked is if a Jew is drafted and I know the government leaders and I can get him off the hook. So they won't draft him into this, but then they'll take another gvir, another wealthy guy, am I allowed to do that? That was a shaila. So what did he do there? Bekitzer, he answered, it depends. If your friend's name is already on the list, you're not allowed to take him off. Because essentially what you're doing is you're taking him off and now another Jew is being taken in his place. That's not fair. And we're not going to get into it. You go back to that previous shir where we discussed his logic more at length. If, however, you're coming to the guy and said, you didn't choose anyone yet, right? Okay, don't choose Chaim Yankel. That you're allowed to do. That was the chiluk that he did. But then at the end of the tshuva he said, hold on. This that I said that you're not allowed to do it if he's already chosen, that you're not allowed to do that. That's only if you know for sure that by getting your friend out, it's inevitable they're going to choose another innocent Jew. Then it's taka not right, then it's not fair. But he says very often it's corrupt officials and the way things work here, it's a bureaucracy and it's not so organized. Very often you get the guy out and then the guy falls asleep and he forgets b'chlal that he needs to do this and he's not going to do it. So it's a suffix. So he says, in that case, and it's a mitzvah rabbah, it's a great thing, get him out and maybe someone else will be taken. So Rabbi Avad Yosef likes this. Because what essentially it's telling you is that you are putting someone else in danger. You may not call it literally nefashas danger, but you're putting them in a serious danger, but it's mutter. You know why? Because that's only a suffix. And right now you have a vadai, and you're allowed to free the vadai to get rid of the suffix. To who? The third party. So therefore, Rabbi Avad Yosef wants to apply that and say the same thing. The Israeli government is getting the guys of Entebbe out. It's a suffix. Maybe something else will happen to these other people. It should be permitted. He brings another tshuva. Rabbi Avad Yosef does a very famous tshuva from the Entebbe Yehuda Rabbi Cheskel Landa. This is Yeridei Siman Reish Yud. And the shaila over here was the rabbi who's writing to the Entebbe Yehuda. His name is Rabbi Leib Fischels, and he's a mechutin to the Entebbe Yehuda. So somehow he's related. The shaila coming from the Jewish community in London. Benidan Hasha'ela Shabbat Alav Mekilas Kodesh London. Okay, so London is a relatively speaking new Jewish community. Jews are readmitted into London, into England in the mid-17th century, right? And so this is happening, I don't think there's a date on this tshuva, but it's sometime in the 1700s, so it's a newer community. They have a shaila and they send it overseas to this Reb Leib Fischels, and Reb Leib Fischels sends it to the Entebbe Yehuda. What was the shaila? That they were doing surgery, physicians were doing surgery on Be'echad Shachala B'choili Ha'evan B'kisa. He had a stone in his kis. This means bladder stones. He had a bladder stone, and at this time, during the 1700s, is when they started tinkering with surgery in order to extract the stones. Okay, by the way, this is pre-anesthesia, and this is pre any knowledge about germs or anything like that. So therefore, no surprise what happens next. The physicians did what they did their surgery. It didn't work, and he died. The shaila of the Chachmei Oyer, the rabbis of the city were asked, is it permitted to do an autopsy so that they see what happens, so that when the next guy comes in with bladder stones, they'll be able to know what to do better. So what's the shaila? An autopsy is nivel hameis. You're cutting into a body that's nivel hameis. You're supposed to. So is this permitted or not? On the one hand, you say it's asur. On the other hand, but it's for hatzalas nefashos. So on the one, the Entebbe Yehuda responds as follows. On the one hand, it's a din aruch mefurish in Shulchan Aruch that even suffix doicha Shabbos achamor, even if it's a doubt, we push off Shabbos. So we'll also push off nivel hameis in order to save a life. However, this is a very famous tshuva. The reason famous tshuva is because famous tshuvas are the tshuvas where new lines are drawn. And this tshuva, a new line is drawn. And that line is, very basic question. When we say, Pikuach nefesh, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? So now obviously, if someone is feeling heart pain, and it could be a very, very small statistical risk, we would all say, okay, yeah, that person should go to the hospital on Shabbos. But as you can see, you can start thinking about other cases, and this could become a little bit of a problem. What is considered risk or not? For example, I'm walking home on Shabbos, and I remember I don't have batteries in my smoke alarm. So do I say that's sakanas nefashos? So I should go buy batteries on Shabbos to put it into my smoke alarm, right? So like, how do you draw the line between these cases? So Rabbi Cheskel Landau, this tshuva is very famous because he draws a line. What does he say? When do we say that we're going to push off Shabbos or Nivel Ameis? That's the key word. Lefanenu. Look at the classic cases in the Gemara. Where Machal Shabbos is a choyle. Choyle is like you see. He's sick. He's saying, I'm sick. I know your name. I know who you are. You're saying you're sick. Okay, now we can talk numbers. It's 5% risk, a 10% risk. I don't care. You're lefanenu. Let's go. We're going to the hospital. Nefila sagal. There's an avalanche. Something fell. A building fell. So I see it right here. Now, maybe there's no one in there. Could be there's no one in there. It could be even if there's people in there, they're dead already. So there's a lot of layers of doubt. Nonetheless, it's here before you. Go in. In our case over here, there is no current person in London who has bladder stones that we know of. They want to learn. Maybe we're going to need this knowledge. So he says, there is no way that we can push away a Isser Torah, even Isser Darabanan, for what? This is very interesting words. He's called a Chashasha Kala, even though I think, if you would say, what are the chances within the next month there's going to be another patient with bladder stones? I think the answer is 100%. 100%. And nonetheless, he's calling it a chashasha kala, which is really interesting. But that's not his main point. His main point is, it's not lefanenu. It's not lefanenu, I ignore it. And then he goes on to make his argument. If you're going to call this case safek nefashis, so then everything should be permitted on Shabbos. You should wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to cook today a medicine. Because maybe at 4 p.m. there's going to be someone who's going to need it. My smoke alarm case that he said before. So he's worried about that, and that's why he's looking for a line. Now, he could have done another line, and that's numbers. Like, what is the chance that there's going to be a fire in my house and that I'm going to need a smoke alarm, right? But he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to do the numbers thing. So therefore, he wants to do lefanenu or not lefanenu. Okay, so that's Adkan is the tshuva. And by the way, so much needs to be said about this, and the poskim in subsequent centuries discuss this at great length. For our purposes, what do you see here? You see a preference for sakanas nefashas lefanenu. That's in a whole other category versus something that's not lefanenu. That's what you see in this tshuva. So Rabbi Avad Yosef wants to bring it into his conversation over here and says, people in Entebbe, that's lefanenu. That halacha looks at that as important. People in the future, the Noda B'Yehuda is not so concerned about the future. He doesn't want to consider that so much. And so therefore we don't need to consider that. And so he uses that to bolster on top of the tshuva of Rabbi Yosef ben Lev, this idea. Again, so in summary, if you want to talk about the Maseches Gittin, the fact that ain't poidin, you're not allowed to poidin, that takana derabanan, pikuach nefesh, forget about it. And anyway, they're doing whatever they could, so forget about it. In terms of the shaila of you're not allowed to be masakin other people, so that's not true. A third party is, and in fact, he brings precedent for this idea that we care about the here and now more than the future. Okay, now we're talking about Entebbe. There is another voice that reaches in certain ways the same conclusion, that a hostage deal in Entebbe was permitted. The difference is going to be not only was permitted, according to the rabbi we're now going to quote, it was the only correct way for that story to end according to halacha. Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, it's important to know his office at this point, because that office is important for his children. His office is, he's the Reish Av Bezin of the Eida Charedis in Eretz Yisrael. I'll say it this way, we don't want to go too much into this, but the concept of the state of Israel, in his view, is a violation of the Shalish Shuas. He says that clearly in this tshuva. He mentions that point in this tshuva. And so therefore, the very existence of the state of Israel is a halachic problem for him. So this is how his tshuva begins. It begins like this. He says, on the one hand, I don't know that a deal is going to be allowed. He says, I don't like the pikuach nefesh exception. I think that you're not allowed to overpay because you're going to incentivize, and he limits the pikuach. He doesn't like. He limits the pikuach nefesh exception, and so therefore, if you go with that, we don't want to incentivize them that they're going to come and take more people. And we're going to have to fall into their ways of bending over to the wants of these terror organizations. So he says, if you follow the basic sugya, normally he's like ready to poskin you're not allowed to do a deal because we don't give in, we don't want to incentivize terror or anything like that. Ulam, after that part of the analysis, he says, Kol zeh lelo hoyil. None of this really worked. And he quotes a tshuva of Maram Lublin. This is going to be really interesting. We had the tshuva of Maram Lublin. At the end of the first class on hostages, we had the tshuva of Meir of Lublin. He was the Rav, 1500s, early 1600s. He had a case over there. There was a case of this Jewish kid who they accused him of a crime, and they had him, and they said, you need to pay a huge amount to get him out. And they're like, do we have to pay this huge amount to get him out? Well, after all, he did a crime and all that. So what happened? Maram Lublin said then, there's no obligation to overpay to get him out, right? And that's the way I said it then. I said that he's saying that it's not an obligation, whatever. But he said there's no obligation to overpay to get him out. That's what Maram Lublin said there. But then at the end of the tshuva, there was a twist. What happened? Maram Lublin said, even though it's pikuach nefesh for him, either begashim or beruchnitz, because either they're going to kill him, or he's going to chas v'shalom, he's going to convert. So even if that's the case, you don't have to overpay. That's what Maram Lublin said over there. And but then he ended and said, well, we consulted with a name. He said a name of someone, and the guy said that it's not going to help. Because if you're going to let the guy die, then the ruler who's causing this problem is just going to come somewhere else to get your money, because he needs your money. He wants your money. So you're not going to have any solution. Moreover, if the guy converts, then that guy's going to cause problems to the Jewish community there. In other ways. And so therefore this is much bigger problem, so therefore you probably should overpay to solve this problem. So Rabbi Weiss uses the same logic. He says, I just reached the halacha that you shouldn't overpay. But he says, just like over there, because of you're not going to solve the problem, you're supposed to overpay, he says the same thing here. He says, the whole world is going to look and say, you didn't free your hostages, and you let them die, and you let them get killed in a brutal way, and you're keeping Palestinian prisoners, and that's also an act of brutality, so brutal all around, and so it's going to give you a bad name. The words he used is lahavish reicham be'enei ha'olam. It's going to cause a real bad name. And so therefore, he's like, you can't follow the halacha and do nothing. You have to do something. He's like, oh, okay, but they did something. They went in there and they took them out militarily. He's like, no, bad idea. That's dangerous. That's causing danger to people. And so that was not a good idea. He doesn't like the rescue, which is another halachic topic about acts of war and things like that we're not going to get into. But he says that wasn't a good idea. And then he says that's only going to cause the terrorists to get more angry. And just like in the case of Maram Lublin, where we're like, oh, if you're not going to overpay, then that Paretz is going to get even more upset and he's going to come at you another way. So now that you're causing the terror, because you freed them, you're going to cause the terrorists to get even more upset. It's interesting, Rabbi Vadia Yosef said you can't make them more upset. He's like, you're going to cause them to get even more upset, and it's going to cause all these problems. So therefore, although pure halacha leads you to know you're not allowed to do this, because of the problems of Chilul Hashem and other similar issues, he says, I don't like this, and we should have overpaid, and we should have let out all these people. And he says, what was the only issue? The only issue was kvoidom. If you look, he writes, you engage in the certain rescue. Even though the Israeli government it's their pride is going to be lowered. So in other words, the way he looks at it, the only reason the Israeli government is not willing to give in is a question of pride. That's all. It's a question of pride. He doesn't like that pride. That type of pride is Zionism. That type of pride is a problem. And so therefore, he doesn't want that pride. The idea that this is actually a security issue, that this is a legitimate security concern, he doesn't regard that. If anything, if you were thinking from a security perspective, he's saying, then you would have made the deal. So a very interesting tshuva from the Ravid of the Eidach HaReidis at that time. But the bottom line is, he's okay with the deal. He's okay with it. The difference between him and Rabbi Vadia Yosef and everyone else is everyone else said, you could go to war if you want to, even though with all the risks involved, and he is saying no. Okay. Now, this Rabbi Weiss, it's part of, you have to look at a little bit of the bigger picture, and with this we're going to conclude about the position of Satmar at this time. So, although he's not officially associated with Satmar, but there's definitely links between the Eidach HaReidis and Satmar. And Satmar's position was, the famous thing was saying that the rescue in Entebbe was not a miracle. So the main thing was, the big discussion was whether it was a miracle. But together with the question of a miracle, there was something else. Apparently, someone got up and made a statement during Tishrei time, maybe Elul Tishrei, that the Israeli government, not only it's not a miracle, but they're responsible for the people who were who died during this mivtza. And the Rebbe was not too thrilled about that statement that was said. Again, I'm not saying that the Minchas Yitzchak Rabbi Weiss made that statement. He did not make that statement. That the Israeli government is, well, he kind of does. He says, that they have in fact already taken a kama. Okay, I don't know, but the Rebbe is not referring to him. The Rebbe is referring to someone else who made some sort of statement that the Israeli government is responsible for the 4 people who were killed during the operation. And the Rebbe waited till after Tishrei, Parshas Chayesara. Parshas Chayesara, the Zoyar in Chayesara speaks about Yoina. Speaks about Yoina. And so the Rebbe will speak about the Zoyar every Shabbos because of the Oris of his father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. And so the Rebbe spoke about Yoina. And the Rebbe quoted a medrash from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, where Yoina did something that, for those learning Perek Echad Rambam, the Rambam counts today as one of the prohibitions. That is to be kovish nevuah, to not do the nevuah. You're supposed to, if Hashem tells you need to say something, you need to say something. Yoina didn't do it. He ran away. Why? So the medrash says, because he didn't want to go to Nineveh, and they're going to listen to the nevuah. It's going to make the Jews look bad. Because the Jews are not listening to the prophets, and the Gentiles are. See, he wanted to protect the Jews, and so therefore he says, I'm going to be over an isser of kovish nevuah. That's what the medrash says. So the Rebbe in the Sicha Chayesara Lamed Zayin said that we have a Jew who stood up and said publicly, and he said that we're going to print this, that a non-Jew wanted to do a good thing, meaning the terrorists, that they wanted to exchange all the Jewish hostages for Palestinian prisoners. Und der Eid is ärger von ihm. Why? Because the Jewish decision to go and do this operation in Entebbe caused the deaths of 4 Jews. Und wenn tut das? In Azmans von Yemei Segula. Was man darf von is Schus sein auf Eden. You're supposed to not talk disparagingly of Jews, but speak about their merit. And the Rebbe said, someone who makes that statement, you're touching you're messing. That's unacceptable with the Eibusher's children. And the Rebbe said, Yoina ben Amitai, hanit gewollt as durcham soll kennen sein a kitter kavidin. Yoina didn't want that through him Jews should look bad. And you are looking ways on how to be mekatrik ayid. So, this is a little bit adjacent to what we've been talking about, but you do see a little bit of this in the Tshuva of the Minchas Yitzchak, where he doesn't like the military action that was there, and that was part of a bigger picture thing that was going on at the time. But again, for our main thing is halachically, you end up having, if you want to keep score, it basically goes like this. The sikkum is that we have at least 6 Rabbanim who put their names out on a heter that said that this is okay. I'm counting Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Meir Amsel, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, Rabbi Vadia Yosef, and Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss. All of these Rabbanim, in one way or another, came up with a reason why the Mishnah in Gittin is not a problem. Suffix Sakana, the Isser to get involved in it, or the dinim about Suffix Sakana, it's, to save someone else, is also not a problem. But then at the same time we saw that there were Rabbanim who said, no, the situation is different and is Asr. Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv. And I do think, though, the common denominator of almost all the sources is a recognition that it's not enough to have the conversation that we saw in the previous 2 classes. Like, yeah, you want to talk Ein Poidin Yeser al Kedei Demeyan and those Hatedim, yeah, that's a valid conversation to bring in, but it's not enough. You also have to talk about Sakana and Vadai Sakana and Safek Sakana, and because this is this whole new reality. How much more so if you want to think about war, which was the point that Rabbi Kamenetsky pointed out. And all of this, I think, is all the big points that have been said, and again and again and again, in the 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000s, into the 21st century. As far as I can tell, almost everything is repeating the basic points that we had here today. But nonetheless, we will do one more class on this subject, because till now, I didn't say anything from the Rebbe on this subject. And what happens is that between 1979 and 1988 or so, during that 10-year stretch, the Rebbe did speak about this a few times, so we'll learn about what those incidents were, what others were saying, and then what the Rebbe said, and with that we'll hopefully wrap up this story.